Until the end of September 2023, you can get a free ebook copy of the Introduction to Moodle 3.9 Plus plugin development book by subscribing to our YouTube channel. Follow the link to subscribe and to claim your copy. So let's look at the required files for plugin development. These are the files that you basically have to define every single time you start a plugin development. The first one of those is version PHP. Now I'm mentioning here a couple of things relating to the development guidelines, and that is that each code file should have the masthead fully stipulated at the top of the file. So this is the masthead. That's the masthead that's recommended to be used for every single file. On top of that, each code file should have a PHP doc block underneath the masthead that describes the file and what it does, as well as defining some tags that are required, and the PHP doc tool will pick up if you don't specify these. And the ones that are usually required are package, copyright, license. Categories only basically used for core APIs, but there are other tags, and we'll look at those again a little later on. So onto version PHP itself, right? You look at that defined Moodle internal or die statement at the top. It's recommended that any file that is not loaded by the browser, can't be called by the browser, should have that at the top after the header stuff. That's simply to ensure that nobody can call the file directly from the browser. Then there are some required properties of plugin having been defined earlier, that are required. So one is your plugin's version, your property called requires, which stipulates what version of Moodle your plugin is for. It's usually that and above. And then you've got your plugin component name, which is your Frankenstein name for your plugin. Okay, component plugin sometimes interchangeably used. Then you've got another property, dependencies. It's optional, you don't need to specify it, but that allows you to specify any dependencies that your plugin might have on other plugins or core functionality. Okay, there are other variables, and if you go to the page in the link here, the documentation page at that link, you'll get more information. It's become quite elaborate. It's turned into a more elaborate system in defining version PHP. But that's your normal minimum that should be required to have in your version PHP. The next one we're going to look at is the language file. Now, Moodle has support for over 80 languages, and the support is provided by putting the strings information, so any string outputs, into language packs. And English, the Australian version, because Moodle was originally developed in Australia, is the default language for code, comments, and documentation. Language files live in the language subdirectory and another subdirectory for the language. So you'll have lang /en/ for the English default language strings. Now, language strings, if you use the English language strings, there's support if you do end up releasing your plugin to the plugins directory. There's some support in translating those language strings, and we'll talk about that at some point later in this course. The file name is basically your plugin's Frankenstein name .php. So for the authentication plugin that we are going to develop, our language file will live in the auth text file lang en auth _ text file php. Okay, and strings are defined as items of a strings associative array. And the minimum required definition for nearly absolutely all plugins is the string plugin name, which then gives is the name that's used when the plugin is being installed or uninstalled, etc. Okay. So we'll talk a little bit more about the language strings. So in your code, to retrieve a language string, you call the get string function with your string name and your plugin name. So your plugin's Frankenstein name in the code. So if the code, let's say the site is in Swahili, then what will happen is the code will look in the Swahili language file to get hold of the string. The function print string will just echo the string directly. So get string into a variable, print string, echo it directly. Right. Runtime parameters can be passed for substitution in the string, and they are passed as a third parameter to the get string or print string calls, and it can be a scalar, an array, even an object, and it is normally referred to as the A variable, $A variable. And so then you can then define the variable in your string. So for example, there I've got an example on the screen there. My full name is a full name, and what you have to remember is it's always enclosed in curly brackets for it to work. However, if you are defining a string with that parameter for substitution, the string must be defined in single quotes. Probably best to have single quotes for all your strings unless it's absolutely or it's easier to use double quotes. Right. The other file, now this is an optional file, but I quite suspect in many cases, if you're doing plugin development, is the db install XML. And this file defines the plugin's database files. It's required for modules, for activity modules, but it's optional for all other plugins. And this XML-DB tool, I've spoken about that before as well, will help you design tables, etc., except when it comes to modules, because you need to have the modules, the install XML file defined to install the module. Whereas in most cases, and I'll say this several times in the course, in most cases what you want to do is get the minimum files enough to get your plugin installed, and then use the XML-DB tool to actually do your tables, create your tables and design your tables before you carry on with your development. Right, exceptions for the libphp file. So that's another file that you'll find many plugins will require the libphp file to be defined. Now sometimes the libphp file only has functions in it, but sometimes it's a requirement that it implements a class. So libphp files, the notable exceptions to not having to define them, because they define their own separate additional required files, is the authentication, the blocks, and local plugins. So each plugin type will have a minimum of functions that must be implemented. This is how the APIs or the plugin system works together. And sometimes, as I said a little earlier, the API requires it to be a class definition. For example, course formats, which we'll look at in a future lesson. Since Moodle loads all the plugins libphp files, it is recommended that the file is kept to a minimum. So those, in a nutshell, are the required files for all plugins. We will go through all the ones that we develop in this course, and we'll see the exceptions. We will be looking at all the exceptions, the authentication, which we're doing in this lesson, blocks and local plugins. So that's it for the presentation. To watch other extracts from the course, click on the playlist link, or alternatively, watch the video describing the course content. Don't forget to subscribe and like, and thanks for watching.